"Look at this guy," Officer Derek Pruitt said, leaning forward over the steering wheel, his voice dropping into that low, certain register he used when he had already made up his mind about something. "Hood up, pacing around city property. That's your guy right there." The late October wind moved through the towering oaks of Piedmont Park in long, slow sweeps, pulling gold and orange leaves from the branches and scattering them across the paved walkways below. It was a Tuesday afternoon, the kind that felt borrowed from summer, crisp enough to remind you winter was coming, warm enough in the sun that you didn't mind standing still. Near the historic stone pavilion on the park's south side, Calvin Reeves wasn't pacing. He was standing perfectly still, the way a man stands when his mind is moving fast enough that his body doesn't need to. He was 41, with close-cropped hair going silver at the temples, wearing a faded charcoal hoodie, worn dark jeans, and black sneakers. His glasses had slid slightly down his nose, and he hadn't bothered to push them back up, because both hands were occupied. One holding a silver tablet, displaying a layered structural schematic, the other holding a mechanical pencil poised over a folded paper covered in hand-drawn annotations. A coffee cup sat on the bench beside him, long gone cold. Calvin Reeves was the lead urban architect for the Piedmont Centennial Revitalization Initiative, personally selected by the City Council after an exhaustive national search. He had beaten out firms from New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles. The project was valued at just under $500 million and represented the most ambitious public works undertaking in the city's history. None of that was visible from 50 yards away through a pair of aviator sunglasses. What was visible to anyone willing to look was a man doing his job with the complete absorption of someone who genuinely loved what he did. Calvin had grown up 3 blocks from this park. He had played in it as a child, brought homework to it as a teenager, and watched it slowly fall apart through his 20s and 30s as budgets were cut and maintenance was deferred, and the fountain in the center finally stopped working entirely one August and was never fixed. He remembered the day his mother brought him here when he was maybe 9 years old, pointed at that fountain, and told him to look at it carefully and imagine what it could be. She wasn't talking about the fountain. She was talking about him. He had spent 14 years building the credentials to earn this project, and the truth was that standing here this afternoon, studying this specific retaining wall, was not a professional obligation. It was something closer to a homecoming. He had designed the replacement fountain himself, working through 11 iterations before he found the shape that felt right. He had personally rerouted the drainage system to preserve the 3 oldest oak trees on the property. He had specified down to the exact quarry of origin the limestone that would be used to restore the pavilion arch he was looking at right now. The details he needed from this particular wall had to be verified in person, because no photograph captured the texture accurately enough for the restoration work he had planned. He had 40 minutes before his colleagues arrived for a site walkthrough, and he intended to use every one of them. He didn't notice the black and white cruiser idling at the park entrance. He was somewhere else entirely. Officer Derek Pruitt was not a stupid man, and it would be a mistake to describe him as one, because stupid men don't last 13 years on the force and accumulate the kind of record he had. Pruitt was something more specific than stupid, and in some ways more dangerous. He was a man who had been consistently, repeatedly, institutionally rewarded for a particular kind of thinking, and that thinking had hardened over 13 years into something he no longer examined because he had never been given a serious reason to. He was 46, broad across the shoulders, with thick fingers and a face that had settled into a permanent expression of mild suspicion. He wore his aviator sunglasses even on cloudy days because he liked what they did to his presence, the way people couldn't read his eyes the way it put him, slightly in control of every interaction before a word was spoken. His uniform was always pressed. Even on the last hour of a shift, the creases held. He performed authority even when no one was watching, because for Pruitt, the performance and the reality had long since merged into a single thing he called professionalism. The way he saw what he saw in the park that afternoon was not a decision exactly. It was more like a reflex that had been trained into him so thoroughly that it operated below the level of conscious thought. Hood up. Black male, probably mid-30s, maybe 40. City property that was technically under maintenance. No visible reason to be standing there for the amount of time he'd been standing there. Every data point his gut had collected over 13 years, firing at once, compiling into a conclusion so fast it felt like instinct rather than assumption. He didn't call it profiling. He had never called it that. He called it reading the scene. And the scene, as far as he was concerned, was reading clearly. Beside him in the passenger seat sat Officer Ryan Casey, 24 years old, 6 months out of the academy, still in that particular phase of early policing, where you spend most of your time carefully watching your training officer to figure out which rules are the written rules and which rules are the real ones. Casey had been watching Pruitt long enough to understand that there was a significant difference between the two, and that questioning the real rules out loud had consequences that questioning the written ones did not. Casey looked through the windshield at the man near the pavilion. He saw a tablet. He saw the park sign at the entrance pedestrian access open to the public until 3 p.m., which was still 90 minutes away. He said this carefully, the way you say something to a man like Pruitt, not as a challenge, just as a fact, offered in case it changed anything. Pruitt didn't look at him. The cruiser rolled forward slow and certain, the tires crunching through a layer of fallen leaves, and Pruitt's hand moved to the door handle with the relaxed confidence of a man who had never in his own story been wrong about something like this. Calvin still didn't look up. Calvin heard the tires before he saw the car, and even then he didn't look up immediately. He finished the measurement he was taking with his eye, made a small mark on his folded paper, and then turned the way you turn when something interrupts you rather than threatens you. The cruiser had parked at a sharp angle across the main path, and Pruitt was already out and walking toward him, one hand resting on his utility belt, in that loose, deliberate way that wasn't relaxed at all. Casey came out the passenger side and hung back near the front bumper arms at his sides. "Afternoon," Pruitt said. It was not a greeting. It had the shape of a greeting, but the tone of a challenge, short, abrasive, the conversational equivalent of a door being closed. Calvin met his eyes and kept them there. "Good afternoon, officer," he said, his voice unhurried. "Something I can help you with?" "You can start by telling me what you're doing, hanging around a restricted structure. The park's open to pedestrians until 3. Calvin said, "And as far as I'm aware, that includes this section. I'm here on city business." He did not say what city business. He did not offer his title, did not name the project, did not reach for his wallet or his tablet. He had learned through years of encounters that followed a script he did not write, but had been forced to memorize that offering more information than was asked for did not help you in situations like this one. It only gave the other person more material to work with. He stated that he was there legally on official business, and he waited. Pruitt didn't like the vocabulary. He didn't like the complete absence of deference in Calvin's posture, the way the man was standing with his shoulders square and his eyes direct, as though this were a conversation between equals and not an officer of the law questioning a suspicious person. People were supposed to get smaller when Pruitt approached. This man had not gotten smaller by even a degree. "We've had reports of vandalism and theft in this area," Pruitt said, closing the distance until he was close enough that Calvin could smell the stale coffee on his breath. "You match the description. There had been no such reports." Casey, standing by the bumper, knew this. He had pulled the sector log on the car's terminal 20 minutes ago, and there was nothing in it. He opened his mouth, and then he looked at the back of Pruitt's neck at the set of the man's shoulders, and he closed it again. "I can show you digital credentials," Calvin said, keeping his voice at the same even pitch. "Or you can call the precinct and have them verify my name, Calvin Reeves. Either one will tell you what you need to know. I'm not looking at a screen, and I'm not making calls for you. Physical ID, now. My wallet is in my vehicle on 10th Street. I walked over to inspect this quadrant." He held the tablet up slightly, not aggressively, just a gesture toward the evidence that was already in his hand. "Everything you need is on here." Pruitt's jaw tightened. He reached for his handcuffs, and the small metallic sound of them unclipping from his belt was quiet, but it carried, and a woman walking a golden retriever along the main path 30 yards away heard it and stopped walking without quite knowing why. Casey saw something on the tablet screen from where he stood, a heading, a logo, a seal he recognized, and he took a step forward. "Hey, Derek, maybe we just..." "Quiet, Casey." Pruitt didn't look at him. His eyes were on Calvin. "Last time. ID in my hand or you're going in the car. I have told you my name," Calvin said, loudly enough now that the words carried past Pruitt to the small number of people who had gathered on the path, a teenage boy, 2 elderly women, the woman with the dog who still hadn't moved. "I have told you I am here on legal business. I have offered you 2 ways to verify that. You have refused both. You are profiling me, officer, and I would strongly recommend you consider what you're doing before you take another step." The calm precision of it, the legal literacy, the complete absence of panic shattered something in Pruitt that might have held if Calvin had just gotten scared the way he was supposed to. Pruitt lunged. He grabbed Calvin's left wrist and wrenched it back and around with the practiced force of a man who had done this hundreds of times, and Calvin's shoulder screamed, and the silver tablet left his hand and hit the concrete path with a sharp crack, the screen splintering across one corner and then the other. Calvin's body was slammed against the rough stone face of the pavilion wall, his cheek catching the edge, and the impact knocked the wind out of him and left a scrape that immediately started to bleed. From the pathway, a woman's voice, clear and unafraid. "He wasn't doing anything. I've been watching him for 20 minutes. He was just standing there reading." Casey rushed over his face, pale, and got his hands on Calvin's other arm, not to add force, but because Pruitt had ordered him over, and he didn't know what else to do. Pruitt kicked Calvin's legs apart, and the handcuffs came out, and the metallic ratcheting sound echoed off the stone, and every person within earshot went completely still. Patricia Okafor had been eating a sandwich on a bench 40 feet away when the cruiser first pulled up, and she had been a freelance journalist for 11 years, long enough to recognize the specific quality of silence that precedes something that matters. She was already on her feet, and her phone was already recording when the handcuffs went on. "You're making a very serious mistake," Calvin said. His voice strained, but still controlled his cheek pressed against the cold stone. "The mayor is meeting me here in 10 minutes. Pruitt yanked him upright by the chain of the cuffs and looked at him with an expression that might have been contempt, or might have been the last defense of a man who could still afford contempt. "The mayor," he repeated, not as a question, but as a dismissal, for the project announcement, Calvin said. "The press conference. The one the precinct was supposed to clear the perimeter for." A very small, very cold sliver of something worked its way through the wall of Pruitt's certainty, but it wasn't big enough to stop him. He looked at the man in cuffs, a black man in a gray hoodie bleeding from the cheek, and the story his gut told him was still louder than the sliver. He shoved Calvin toward the cruiser. Casey, standing near the hood, picked up the cracked tablet from the ground. The screen was still lit. Casey held the broken tablet in both hands and looked at the screen, and the world went very quiet for him in a way he hadn't experienced before. Not the ordinary quiet of a slow afternoon, but the quiet of understanding. Something that cannot be understood partially. Something that arrives all at once and rearranges everything. The screen was cracked diagonally across the lower right corner, but still fully functional, still displaying the last open file exactly as Calvin had left it. It was not a photograph. It was not a web page or a social media feed. It was a proprietary architectural rendering, layered, detailed, color-coded by construction phase, and stamped across the upper portion. In the unmistakable format of an official city document was the seal of the city council, the authorization header of the mayor's office, and in bold type near the top of the document, project lead, Calvin Reeves, Chief Architect, Centennial Revitalization Initiative. Casey read it twice. His mouth had gone dry in a way that had nothing to do with the October air. He looked at Pruitt, who was telling the crowd to step back with the automatic authority of a man who was still, as far as he was concerned, in complete control of the situation. He looked at the back window of the cruiser, where Calvin was visible as a silhouette, a man in a gray hoodie, hands behind his back, cheek bleeding against the plastic divider. He looked at the tablet again. What he felt was not quite guilt and not quite panic. It was something more physical than either of those words, a kind of cold pressure moving through his chest, as if his body understood before his mind. Did that a line had been crossed, and that he had been standing on the wrong side of it? "Hey, Derek," he started, his voice coming out smaller than he intended. Pruitt was adjusting his collar with the satisfied air of a man who had just done something efficiently, and he talked straight over Casey, without looking at him already. Narrating the arrest to himself in the language of the incident report he would write later. Uncooperative suspect loitering on restricted city property, failed to produce identification, resisted lawful detention. Casey set the tablet down on the hood of the cruiser screen, facing up the city seal, visible to anyone who looked. He did not say why he set it that way. He wasn't sure he could have explained it even to himself. Something between leaving evidence and leaving a door open, a small, unconscious act of a person who had already decided something without quite admitting he had decided it. The crowd on the path had grown to 15, maybe 18 people. Patricia Okafor had moved closer. The teenage boy who had been watching on his phone for the past 4 minutes finally pressed record. 2 elderly women near the far bench stood close together without speaking, and neither of them left. The back seat of a police cruiser is designed to be uncomfortable, and not just physically. The hard-molded plastic, the smell of industrial cleaner, and old anxiety. The window that shows you the world through reinforced glass at a slightly wrong angle, as if to remind you that you are no longer part of it. Calvin sat with his wrists bound behind him, in a position his shoulder was already registering as an injury, and he breathed slowly and deliberately, and let his mind go where it always went, when his body was occupied with something unpleasant to the work. He thought about the pavilion wall he had been studying before the cruiser pulled up. The mortar between the limestone blocks was the original 1924 material, and the restoration team needed to match not just the composition, but the color aging, which meant sourcing limestone from the same geological formation as the original. He had been trying to verify today whether the northwest corner of the wall showed the same moisture infiltration pattern as the survey photographs, because if it did, the drainage rerouting would need to extend 6 feet further than the current plan specified. He thought about his mother, who had died 4 years ago and never seen the project approved, never seen his name on the city council's official correspondence, never seen the fountain design he had worked through 11 iterations to get right. He thought about the afternoon she brought him here as a child and pointed at the broken-down fountain and told him to imagine what it could be. He did not think about Pruitt. Outside the window, he could see the crowd more people now than when the cuffs went on, and Patricia still holding her phone steady, and Casey standing by the hood of the car, not looking at the cruiser. Calvin could see the tablet on the hood. He could see the screen from where he sat, the city seal just visible through the cracked glass, and he thought with a very specific, almost clinical detachment that it was interesting how much information was available to anyone who looked carefully and how thoroughly Pruitt had declined to look. He closed his eyes. The scrape on his cheek had stopped feeling sharp and started feeling dull, which meant it was settling in for the long term. His wrists ached. His shoulder was going to be worse tomorrow than it was right now. He did not pray. He was not a man who prayed in moments like this. He was a man who waited with the particular patience of someone who has learned that the truth does not require assistance, only time. He waited. The sound arrived before the vehicles did a low, synchronized rumble from the direction of the park's main entrance, the kind of sound that carries a certain kind of institutional weight before you've identified its source, the way a room knows a door has opened before anyone turns to look. 3 black Lincoln Navigators rolled down the tree-lined avenue that led into the heart of the park, moving at the measured, deliberate pace of a convoy that knows it doesn't need to hurry. Leading them was a sleek black sedan with municipal-exempt plates, and behind it, the crowd on the path began to part and murmur the way crowds do when something arrives that is clearly more significant than whatever was happening before it. Pruitt watched the convoy approach and felt in that first moment a surge of something that was very close to pride. He assumed with the breezy confidence of a man who had spent 13 years assuming things correctly that this was the mayor's advance team arriving early, and that what the advance team would find was a secured perimeter, a cleared pavilion, and an officer who had proactively handled a situation before it could become a problem. He squared his shoulders and straightened his collar and walked toward the vehicles with the easy swagger of a man expecting acknowledgement. The doors of the lead SUVs opened simultaneously. 4 men in dark suits stepped out and fanned into positions with the practiced efficiency of the mayor's security detail, eyes moving hands at their sides, assessing the scene in a matter of seconds. Then the rear door of the main sedan swung open. Mayor James Whitmore was 58 years old, broad-shouldered, and direct, a man known throughout city politics for the bluntness of his communication style and the genuine ferocity of his temper when he felt that his people, the people of his city, the people who worked for it, had been mistreated. He stepped out into the October air and adjusted his navy suit jacket and looked toward the pavilion, ready to smile, ready to shake Calvin Reeves's hand in front of the press pool that should have been arriving behind him. Instead, he saw a fractured crowd, a woman with a phone raised at head height, a cracked silver tablet lying face up on the hood of a police cruiser. A police cruiser parked aggressively across the main walkway, lights still pulsing. His smile dissolved in the time it takes to take a breath. Pruitt reached him before the security detail could intervene, introduced himself, gave his badge number, began his report with the confident fluency of a man delivering good news. Suspicious individual loitering on city property, now secured area ready for the event. Whitmore let him finish. Then he looked past him at the tablet on the hood, and something in his face changed in a way that had nothing to do with politics. He knew that tablet. He had given it to Calvin Reeves himself 3 months ago at the meeting where the project budget was finalized. The city seal case, the engraved initials on the back. He looked at Pruitt. His voice, when it came, was very quiet, and it carried to every person within 30 feet. "Where is Calvin Reeves?" Pruitt blinked. The name arrived without context, without recognition, without any of the meaning it should have carried, and that blankness, that total absence of recognition on Pruitt's face, was the sound of the landmine going off beneath him. Casey's hand went up, slowly pointing toward the cruiser, and his face had the look of someone who has been holding a very heavy thing for a very long time, and has just been given permission to set it down. Mayor Whitmore walked to the car. He stopped at the rear window and looked through the reinforced tinted glass, and what he saw was a man in a gray hoodie sitting in the back of a police vehicle, with his hands bound behind him and a dark scrape along his left cheekbone, visible even through the distortion of the glass. Whitmore stood there for a moment that felt longer than it was, and the crowd around him held its collective breath, the way crowds do when they understand that what happens next will matter. He turned around. He looked at Pruitt. What moved across his face was not the performative anger of a politician managing optics. It was something older and more honest than that, the genuine fury of a man who cares about something real and has just watched it be damaged. He breathed once through his nose, and the quiet before he spoke stretched long enough that Pruitt actually shifted his weight. "Get him out," Whitmore said, not loudly, but in a register that carried through the entire open space of the pavilion courtyard, reaching the last person at the edge of the crowd. "Get him out of that car right now." Pruitt's hands moved to his keys with a speed that was its own kind of confession, the sudden, clumsy urgency of a man who has understood too late the full weight of what he has done. He dropped the key once retrieved it from the pavement, got it into the cuff lock on the second try. Calvin stepped out of the cruiser and turned to face the assembled crowd, and the sight of him, the bleeding cheek, the raw red lines the cuffs had left on his wrists, the quiet steadiness in his posture, despite all of it, produced a sound from the crowd that wasn't a gasp and wasn't a cheer, but was somewhere between both a collective exhale of people who have been holding something in. Calvin looked at Whitmore. He did not perform relief. He did not perform victimhood. He said the mayor's first name the way you say the name of someone you have worked alongside for 2 years, naturally and without ceremony. And he said that he was sorry for not being ready to brief the press, and that as the mayor could see, he had been delayed. The simplicity of it, the complete unwavering composure of a man who had just been slammed into a stone wall and locked in a police car, choosing to begin with an apology for being late, landed in the crowd with more force than any speech could have. Whitmore's hand came up, palm open, extended toward Pruitt. He didn't say please. He didn't explain. He held the hand out and waited. Pruitt reached up to his chest with the mechanical movement of a man whose body is doing something his mind has not caught up to, yet unclasped the shield from his uniform and placed it in the mayor's open palm. The metal made a small sound when it touched the mayor's hand, and that sound was the only one in the park for a full 2 seconds. His defense came out in fragments: family 13 years, protocol union, and Whitmore cut through each of them in turn, not with volume, but with specificity, the way you cut through something with a precise instrument rather than a hammer. When Pruitt said the word protocol, Whitmore stopped and looked at him for a long moment before answering, and what he said was quiet enough that only the people closest to them heard it clearly. But what it meant was that protocol was not a word that covered what had happened here today, and that they both knew it. Casey was given his orders: escort Pruitt back to the precinct. Full unedited statement to the chief of police, both officers relieved of patrol duties, effective immediately. Casey nodded without speaking. He looked at Calvin once briefly, and Calvin was not looking at him. Calvin was watching the mayor, and his expression was composed and unreadable, and contained everything it needed to contain. The cruiser reversed out of the park slowly, and the crowd watched it go in complete silence, and no one cheered, because what they were watching wasn't a victory so much as an accounting, and those are different things. The press pool crested the hill at the south entrance. At that exact moment, cameramen and sound technicians and reporters, who had come expecting a ribbon cutting, who had come to cover the announcement of a beautiful new park, and had instead walked into something that would be on national news before sunset. They saw Calvin Hayes standing beside the mayor with blood drying on his cheek and his wrists still visibly raw, and the cameras found his face and did not look away. Patricia Okafor had already uploaded the video before the mayor began speaking. She did it from the same bench where she had been eating her sandwich an hour ago, with the calm efficiency of someone who understands that the most important thing she can do right now is get the truth into the world before anyone can shape a different version of it. Whitmore spoke without notes. He named what had happened plainly without the hedging language of official statements. And he named Pruitt, and he named the project. And he said that the city would not pour $500 million into concrete and glass if the people who were supposed to protect its citizens couldn't tell the difference between a criminal and an architect, studying a wall in a park that was open to the public. Calvin stood beside him and said nothing, and his silence was its own form of testimony. When Whitmore finished and stepped back, Calvin moved to the cluster of microphones with the unhurried ease of a man who has thought carefully about what he is going to say and has decided to say only that, nothing more. He did not adjust the microphones or look out at the crowd for an extended moment or perform the kind of composure that lets you know someone is performing it. He simply spoke. He talked about the park, what it had been when he was a child, what it had become, what it was going to be. And the language he used was the language he always used when he talked about his work, the language of structure and material, and the relationship between space and the people who move through it. He said that the fountain in the center of the new park was going to be made of stone from the same mountain range as the original, because some things deserve to be honored when they're rebuilt rather than just replaced. He said that the tablet on the ground back there still had every file he needed, cracked screen and all, and that he intended to finish the wall measurement this afternoon as soon as he had his hands back in a condition to hold a pencil. A few people in the crowd laughed genuinely briefly, and the sound of it broke something that had been held tight in the air since the cruiser first pulled up. He said that he did not intend to let what had happened to him today become only a story about what had happened to him. He said it the way you say something that is already decided, not as a declaration, but as a statement of existing fact. 2 questions from the press answered directly and briefly. Then he stepped back from the microphones, and the press conference that was supposed to be about a park became the story it actually was, which was about what a city does with the worst of itself when the light is on and everyone is watching. Patricia lowered her phone for the first time in 40 minutes. The teenage boy on the path looked at his own screen at the footage he'd captured, and then at Calvin, and then back at the screen, trying to understand what he was part of. The woman with the golden retriever who had never left stood at the edge of the crowd with her hand on her dog's collar, and her face had the expression of someone who will remember this particular afternoon for a very long time. Patricia's video crossed 1 million views before the press conference ended. She watched the number climb on her phone's screen with the detached attention of a professional who knows that the numbers are not the point. The numbers are just proof that the point is landing. The Internal Affairs interrogation room in the 14th precinct was a small, windowless rectangle with fluorescent lighting that had always had a very faint flicker at the far end, the kind of thing you stopped noticing after a few minutes, unless you had nothing else to look at, and Pruitt had been sitting in here for 40 minutes with nothing else to look at. He was used to this room from the other side of the table. He had been in it a half-dozen times over the years, after complaints were filed, after incidents needed reviewing, and from the other side of the table with his badge on his chest, and his answers prepared. The room had never felt particularly threatening. It was just a room. It had a table and 2 chairs, and a recording device mounted in the upper corner, and a door that locked from the outside. He had always walked out of it when he was done. The badge was gone. The gun was gone, checked in at the desk on his way in procedure for an officer under investigation. The radio was gone. Without them sitting in the chair that was usually occupied by someone he was questioning, the room felt different in a way that was difficult to describe, but immediately and comprehensively apparent. He felt like a structure that had lost its load-bearing walls, still technically standing, but requiring a great deal of effort to remain upright. He was running the same loop he had been running since the mayor's convoy pulled up standard protocol. Uncooperative suspect, reasonable suspicion judgment call. The words were the same words he had used after the other 6 complaints, and they had always worked before, not because they were particularly convincing arguments, but because the machinery of internal resolution had been designed to accept them and move on. He had relied on that machinery for 13 years and had never been given a serious reason to doubt it. The door opened without a knock. 2 IA detectives walked in, both of them women, which Pruitt noticed without meaning to, and they set a thick manila folder on the table between them, with a sound that was louder than it needed to be, and Pruitt flinched slightly before he could stop himself. The folder was his file, 13 years of it. The first detective sat down and opened it, and began reading. Not dramatically, not with any performance of judgment, just reading the way you read a document that contains facts you are going to state aloud. 6 excessive force complaints, all marked internally resolved. 4 formal allegations of racial profiling during traffic stops. 2 body camera deactivations during physical altercations, both flagged, neither resulting in disciplinary action. And now, the unprovoked assault and false arrest of the city's lead architect for its most significant public works project in 3 decades, recorded in high definition from 3 separate angles, already at 2 million views. He was non-compliant, Pruitt said, his voice still carrying the echo of its former certainty. He refused a lawful order. The second detective looked at him for a moment before she responded. He refused a lawful order, she repeated, and your response was to slam him into a stone wall while the mayor's convoy was pulling into the parking lot. She let that sit in the air for a beat. You didn't feel threatened, Officer Pruitt. You felt disrespected. Those are different things, and the video makes it very clear which one it was. The pension landed like a physical blow when it was mentioned the specific word, pension, the thing he had spent 13 years building, now subject to forfeiture proceedings that the department's legal team was already preparing. The union president had called Chief Osei before Pruitt's cruiser had even finished reversing out of the park. They had watched the video. Their answer was one sentence: they would not be providing representation in the internal disciplinary proceedings. Pruitt sat in the flickering light of a room he had always left before and understood with a clarity that arrived too late to be useful that no one was coming to explain this away. Chief of Police Diane Osei had been running the 14th Precinct for 4 years, and she had spent most of those 4 years trying to fix from the inside the accumulated damage of decades of a departmental culture that protected its worst actors by treating accountability as disloyalty. She was 54, sharp-eyed and exhausted in the specific way of someone who genuinely cares about a thing that keeps resisting being cared for. And when she sat down across from Ryan Casey in the conference room with a notepad and a cup of coffee, she hadn't touched. The exhaustion was visible in the set of her jaw, but so was something else, a focused operational anger that had been looking for somewhere to go. Casey looked terrible. He was 24 years old, and he looked 10 years older than that, the kind of aging that happens when you understand something about yourself that you would have preferred not to know. Osei didn't offer him softness or condemnation. She asked him to walk her through every second, from the moment the cruiser pulled up to the moment the mayor's sedan arrived, and she asked him not to summarize or abbreviate or skip the parts that were uncomfortable. She told him she needed the full truth in the right order, and she needed it now, before anyone had a chance to agree on a version of events. Casey told her. He told her about Pruitt's comment in the car before they'd even stopped. He told her about the park sign and the sector log he'd checked, which showed no complaints, no reports, nothing that could reasonably be called a basis for a stop. He told her about the tablet, what he saw on the screen, what he understood when he read it, and what he chose to do with that understanding, which was nothing, which was to set it on the hood of the car and not push back when Pruitt kept talking. He said this last part without looking for forgiveness, which Osei noted. When he finished, he asked her if he should submit his resignation. He asked it carefully, as if he had been rehearsing the question on the drive over, as if he thought it might be the right kind of sacrifice. Osei told him no, and the directness of it surprised him into silence. She told him that resigning was the easiest thing he could do right now, and that it was also the least useful thing, and that she needed something from him that was considerably more difficult than walking away. She needed a complete written incident report, notarized with nothing omitted. She needed him at Pruitt's disciplinary hearing. She needed him to understand that if the district attorney moved toward federal charges, which given what she had already seen of the video and the file she considered likely, she would need him on the stand. She looked at him steadily and said that there was no version of making this right that didn't cost him something real. Casey was quiet for a long moment. Then he picked up the pen she had set on the table in front of him, and he started to write. Patricia Okafor's video was not the only footage of what happened in the park that Tuesday afternoon, but it was the clearest and the first to reach the large platforms, and it moved through the internet with the particular velocity of something that touches a nerve that has been sensitive for a very long time. By 6 in the evening, a high school teacher in Cleveland had shared it with a single sentence. "This is why I don't let my son wear hoodies anymore, and I hate that I said that." A retired firefighter in Savannah watched it 3 times without sharing it or commenting, which was its own kind of response. A woman in her early 60s in Memphis recognized the park bench from a family trip she'd taken there years ago, and that recognition made the whole thing feel more real in a way she later struggled to articulate. The hashtag emerged without coordination, the way things emerge when enough people arrive at the same word independently. It wasn't a slogan or a rallying cry. It was just Calvin's name and the park's name, and those two things together carried everything that needed to be carried. The counter-narrative began within a few hours because it always does. A portion of commenters questioned why Calvin hadn't simply produced identification and avoided the whole situation, the argument that compliance is the cure for everything offered, with a confidence that didn't require any engagement with the question of why a man doing his job on public land should need to justify his existence to anyone. These voices were not cartoons. They were people the audience knew, people who sat near them at Thanksgiving, people who called this playing it safe and meant it. They got tens of thousands of likes. The department's social media pages became unusable. Every post a missing child alert, a recruitment announcement, a traffic advisory was flooded within minutes with screenshots from the video, and the communications team stopped posting before nightfall. A small group of protesters assembled outside the precinct by 7 p.m. They weren't organized. They had shown up individually after seeing the video and found each other on the sidewalk. They had handmade signs, and they stood in the cold, without a speaker or a stage or an agenda beyond being visible, and the evening news cameras found them there and covered them because they were the most honest story on the block. The city that went to sleep that Tuesday night was not the same city that had woken up that morning. The difference wasn't loud or dramatic. It was the particular unsettled feeling of something that has been named out loud for the first time and cannot be unnamed again. Calvin made the decision in the emergency room waiting area, while a nurse was applying a second layer of gel wrap to his right wrist, and the television in the corner was showing his own face on a national news broadcast with the sound turned off. He made it the way he made most decisions, not impulsively, not dramatically, but with the settled certainty of a person who has run the calculations and arrived at the only answer that makes sense. He was not going to take a settlement. He was not going to sign a non-disclosure agreement. He was not going to disappear from this story in exchange for a number that would allow the department to continue functioning exactly as it had been functioning, which was the point of such agreements, not to resolve anything, but to insulate the institution from the cost of resolving it. He made 2 phone calls from the waiting room. The first was to his project manager to confirm that the site walkthrough could be rescheduled for Thursday and that the wall documentation could wait 2 days. The second was to attorney Veronica Cross. Cross was nationally known in civil rights law, not because she sought the spotlight, but because she was exceptionally good at her work and the work had brought her into the light anyway. She was calm, strategic, and completely uninterested in cases she couldn't win in ways that mattered. She watched Patricia's video before Calvin finished explaining the situation, and her assessment when she spoke was direct. This was not a complicated case in terms of liability, and the question, therefore, was not whether the city would have to answer for what happened, but what they would have to build in exchange for that answer. Calvin came to their first formal meeting with a handwritten proposal that Cross initially mistook for notes, and then understood when she read it was in fact a finished document. It was an architect's proposal, structured precise, every component load-bearing. He wanted an independent civilian oversight board, equipped with genuine subpoena power, not an advisory panel that produced recommendations that could be ignored, but a body with the actual legal authority to compel testimony and access records. He wanted mandatory psychological rescreening for every officer in the department who had accumulated excessive force complaints, not as punishment, but as a structural requirement, the way you inspect a bridge for stress fractures at regular intervals, because the alternative is waiting for the collapse. He wanted the department's discretionary budget for militarized equipment tied directly to civilian complaint data so that a pattern of abuse had an automatic financial consequence. The redirected funds going specifically to community programs in the neighborhoods most affected by that pattern. When the city's attorneys brought the initial settlement, offer $5 million, standard non-disclosure language, a press release acknowledging the incident without admitting liability, Calvin rejected it publicly in a 3-sentence written statement, released before the ink on their offer was dry. The statement said that he was not interested in money that came with a gag attached, and that the people of this city deserved a response to what had happened that was still visible 10 years from now. Mayor Whitmore, who had been watching his own political future contract sharply since the afternoon in the park, championed Calvin's counter-proposal before the city council, with a personal conviction that surprised people who had assumed his outrage at the park was performance. The police union's response was organized, and aggressive sick-outs hired communication firms. Political pressure applied to council members facing re-election. It was a playbook the union had used before, and it had worked before, but Patricia's video was still everywhere. The cracked tablet was on the cover of a national magazine. The council vote, when it finally came after 72 hours of negotiation, passed by a narrow margin that felt historic, because it was. The grand jury returned an indictment on 3 counts: felony false imprisonment, aggravated assault, and deprivation of civil rights, under color of law. The last count carrying the most weight legally and symbolically, because it meant the federal government was treating what happened in that park not as a bad decision by one officer, but as a violation of a citizen's constitutional guarantees by someone acting in the name of the state. The courtroom on the first day of trial was full in a way that courtrooms rarely are, not just with observers and press, but with a specific quality of attention, the focused, patient attention of people who have waited a long time for something to be examined in the light. Calvin sat in the front row of the gallery in a dark suit, his posture straight, his expression the same composed steadiness he had maintained throughout the afternoon in the park. He had learned something over the course of the year since that afternoon about what composure actually is: not the suppression of feeling, but the decision to let your purpose be larger than your pain. Pruitt's defense attorney was competent and thorough, and he built his case on the architecture of the argument that had protected officers like Pruitt for decades. The neighborhood's crime statistics, the ambiguity of the situation, the split-second demands of field work, the genuine difficulty of the job. He tried to establish that Calvin's refusal to immediately produce physical identification was itself a form of non-compliance that any reasonable officer would have found concerning. He was good at his job, and under different circumstances in a different moment, with a different jury, the argument might have done more damage. The prosecution built its case on 3 things: The first was Patricia Okafor's video, played in full on a large screen in a silent courtroom, the sound of the shove against the pavilion wall, the clatter of the tablet hitting the pavement, the metallic ratcheting of the handcuffs, and Calvin's voice, steady and clear, stating his name and his rights and the reasons he was there before any of it happened. Played at courtroom volume in a room built for acoustics, the video was not a summary or an interpretation. It was the event itself experienced without distance. The second was Pruitt's disciplinary file entered into evidence in its entirety, 13 years. Read into the record count by count, complaint by complaint, each one marked internally resolved, and each one now understood in the context of everything else as a door that had been closed so that Pruitt could keep walking. The third was Ryan Casey. Casey took the stand on the fourth day of the trial, and he looked, as Patricia Okafor would later write in her account of the proceedings, like someone who had aged more in 1 year than most people do in 10. He answered every question without hesitation and without self-pity, and he did not attempt to minimize his own role in what had happened or to position his failure to intervene as anything other than what it was. He said that Pruitt had profiled Calvin before the cruiser stopped moving. He said that the park sign clearly indicated the area was open to pedestrians. He said that he had seen the tablet read the name and the title understood what it meant and chose silence over intervention because he was afraid of the professional cost of contradicting his training officer. He said the word afraid plainly without dressing it in better language. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. The foreman stood, and the courtroom went still in a way that made the sound of the ventilation system suddenly audible. And he read the 3 counts in order, and after each one said guilty, and each one landed separately with its own weight and its own silence. At sentencing, the judge spoke specifically about the phrase abuse of public trust and returned to it more than once because it was the phrase that contained everything else: the badge, the wall, the cuffs, the file. The 13 years of complaints that had been quietly closed and filed away, while Pruitt continued doing exactly what he had always done. 7 years federal penitentiary. The bailiff stepped forward with the handcuffs, and the sound they made when they closed around Pruitt's wrists was the same sound they had made in the park, the same flat metallic click. And Pruitt looked back at the gallery as he was led out, and his eyes found Calvin's, and there was nothing left in them that resembled the man who had stood at the pavilion wall and told himself he was reading the scene. Calvin held the eye contact for a moment, and then he looked away because there was nothing more he needed from that direction. The changes didn't arrive in a single moment. They came the way structural repairs come incrementally, in ways that are only visible if you know what you're looking for. And then, one day, you look at the building and realize it's carrying weight it couldn't have carried before. The Civilian Oversight Board held its first public hearing 6 weeks after the council vote in a community center 3 blocks from the park. 12 residents sat at the table with microphones and the legal authority to compel testimony, and the room was full, and one of the people in the back row was a woman in her late 40s who had filed a complaint against a 14th precinct officer 4 years earlier, and had been told in a form letter that the matter had been internally resolved. She sat in the back row and didn't speak during the hearing, but she stayed for the entire 3 hours, and at the end, she folded up her copy of the agenda and put it in her bag. A veteran officer with 2 excessive force complaints in his file requested voluntary rescreening in the program's 2nd month, not because it was required yet, but because something in the way his department looked at him had shifted since the trial, and he had started looking at himself the way they were looking at him, and he didn't entirely like what he saw. He completed the screening. He stayed on the force. He was not a simple story in either direction. The money redirected from the militarized equipment budget became a youth sports program, a community health clinic, with 2 days a week of free mental health services, and a mural on the wall of the precinct's community liaison office, painted by a local artist from the neighborhood the precinct was supposed to serve. Patricia Okafor published her investigation into the 6 closed complaints in Pruitt's file 8 months after the trial. The piece ran to 12,000 words and named every person, and 3 of those people called her after publication, not to object, but to say simply that they were glad someone had finally put their name in print. Chief Osei's department did not become a different institution overnight, and she would have told you that herself, without being asked, because she was not a person who mistook process for outcome. But something in it was different, some quality of atmosphere, some adjustment in what was treated as normal, and she noticed it, and she considered it cautiously a beginning. Casey was still at the 14th. He was not the same officer who had stood by the hood of the cruiser with a tablet in his hands and said nothing, and he carried that knowledge with him like a compass that pointed in one direction, regardless of where he was standing. October came back around with the same crisp, particular quality it always had in this city, the air carrying the smell of leaves turning, and something else underneath, something that might just have been the feeling of a year having passed, and the world being in specific and demonstrable ways different than it was. The crumbling stone pavilion was gone. In its place rose a glass and open steel atrium of quiet, substantial beauty, not the kind of building that announces itself, but the kind that earns your attention gradually, the way well-made things do. The original limestone masonry from the pavilion's base had been incorporated into the new structure's foundation, cleaned and reset, and given a context that honored what it had been while being clear about what it was now. The atrium was open on 3 sides to the park, flooded with afternoon light, designed so that the interior and exterior felt continuous rather than separated. Calvin had spent 14 months on this building. The fountain in the center of the park's main plaza was running. The drainage system had been rerouted to preserve all 3 of the oldest oaks, and they stood over the eastern walkway, exactly as they always had, slightly taller now in the October light. The crowd that gathered for the ribbon cutting was large and genuinely mixed, the kind of crowd that assembles when something belongs to people rather than being offered to them, and the difference in feeling is immediately evident to anyone in it. Mayor Whitmore spoke briefly. He had learned over the past year that fewer words served him better than more, and the building behind him was doing most of the speaking anyway. Patricia Okafor sat in the front row with a press credential and a notebook, and she was covering the story the way she had always covered it, carefully with full attention, trying to get it right. Calvin stepped to the microphone and spoke for less than 4 minutes about the park and his mother and the fountain and what it means to build something for a place you come from. And when he finished, the crowd was quiet for a moment before the applause, and that moment of quiet was its own kind of acknowledgement. The scissors cut the ribbon, and the crowd moved forward into the new space. Somewhere in the measured quiet of a federal penitentiary yard, Derek Pruitt sat on a concrete bench in October light that came in at the same low angle as the afternoon light in the park. He had been here 11 months, and he had stopped counting the days the way you stop counting something when the counting stops helping. His uniform was gone, the pressed creases, the polished badge, the aviator sunglasses, and without them, he had discovered slowly, and without anyone to tell him otherwise, that the authority he had spent 13 years confusing with identity had not been a quality of his character, but a quality of the equipment, and that, without the equipment, he was simply a man sitting on a bench in the cold, trying to understand what the last 13 years had actually been. The October light moved across the concrete yard, and he watched it and said nothing, because there was no one to say anything to, and nothing to say that would change the direction the light was moving. Back in the park, a girl of maybe 7 ran under the glass atrium for the first time, her sneakers slapping against the new stone, her arms out for balance that she didn't actually need. She ran to the center of the space and then stopped the way children stop when something surprises them from the inside rather than the outside. And she looked straight up at the ceiling, at the October sky, visible through the glass, at the light falling through it, at that particular angle that only happens in October at this hour in a city where someone built a ceiling, specifically so that the sky would look like that from below. She laughed, and the sound of it went up into the glass and came back down, changed the way sounds do in spaces that were built to carry them, and the people nearest to her looked up too involuntarily, the way you look when someone laughs at something you want to see. Calvin was standing on the steps at the edge of the atrium away from the crowd for a moment, his back to the plaza. His hand was in his jacket pocket, and his thumb was moving slowly over something, the familiar weight of it, the specific texture of cracked glass in one corner, the raised edge where the screen had separated slightly from the frame when it hit the pavement. He had been offered a replacement 3 times and declined 3 times, and he had never explained why, because the reason was not the kind of thing that needed to be said out loud. He stood on the steps of the building he had built in the park he had come home to, and he listened to the girl laugh in the light, and he kept his hand in his pocket, and he stayed. If this story moved, you please share it with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss the stories that matter.